In the Vatican secret archives, buried beneath centuries of dust and deliberately misfiled documents, lies a single page that three popes have tried to destroy. Written in the trembling hand of a Habsburg court physician in 1547, it contains a list, not of diseases or treatments, but of calculated genetic manipulations that would make modern eugenicists weep with envy. The document begins with a single chilling sentence: "The preservation of divine blood requires the sacrifice of human flesh." What follows is the blueprint for the most sophisticated breeding program in human history, one that turned royal bloodlines into weapons of genetic warfare against their own descendants. Tonight, you're going to learn what they never wanted you to know: that the European royal families didn't just marry their relatives by accident or tradition. They were following a deliberate plan, a scientific program of genetic concentration that predates modern genetics by centuries. They understood something about heredity that wouldn't be officially discovered until Mendel's pea plants. Something so dark and calculating that it reveals the true nature of power itself. That those who rule over others are willing to sacrifice their own children's humanity to maintain their grip on control. You think royal inbreeding was about keeping wealth in the family or maintaining political alliances. But the truth is far more sinister. They discovered that certain genetic combinations produce not just physical deformities, but psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited, mental patterns that could be predicted, and most importantly, a kind of genetic slavery that bound entire bloodlines to serve the interests of the system rather than challenge it. The deformed children, the mad queens, the early deaths, these weren't unfortunate side effects. They were the intended consequences of a program designed to breed perfect victims who would maintain the system that destroyed them. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the operating manual for human genetic manipulation, refined over centuries and still being used today by those who understand that the ultimate form of control isn't over your body or your mind, but over your very DNA. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a deformity. It was a signature, a brand marking those who had been genetically modified to serve power rather than wield it. By 1400, European royal courts had already discovered what wouldn't be taught in universities for another 4 centuries: that human consciousness itself could be altered through selective breeding. They didn't need to understand chromosomes or DNA. They had something more valuable: detailed records of how specific genetic combinations affected not just physical traits, but mental capabilities, emotional responses, and most crucially, the capacity for independent thought and rebellion against authority. The Habsburg family became the master experimenters in this genetic laboratory, treating their own bloodline as both the hypothesis and the test subject. Each generation was a carefully controlled experiment in human consciousness modification. They tracked which cousin marriages produced children who were compliant versus those who were rebellious, which genetic combinations created minds that could rule versus those that could only serve, which bloodline mixtures generated the psychological profiles needed for different roles in their power structure. What they discovered was revolutionary. Inbreeding didn't just concentrate physical traits, it concentrated psychological ones. The famous Habsburg melancholy, the tendency toward religious obsession, the inability to form healthy relationships, the paranoia and anxiety that plagued generation after generation. These weren't random side effects. They were the intended features of a genetic program designed to create rulers who would be psychologically incapable of dismantling the systems that had created them. The most brilliant aspect of their genetic manipulation was that they made the victims complicit in their own destruction. Each generation of inbred royals, despite their suffering, despite their deformities, despite their mental anguish, continued the breeding program. They couldn't stop because their very genetics had been programmed to prioritize the continuation of the bloodline over their own welfare or that of their children. They had been bred to be addicted to their own genetic destruction, unable to choose health over heritage, unable to value individual welfare over dynastic continuation. This wasn't weakness. It was the most sophisticated form of genetic mind control ever developed, one that turned free will itself into a hereditary impossibility. The court mathematicians of the 16th century weren't just calculating taxes and trade routes. They were developing the algorithms of genetic destruction. In the private chambers of the Escorial Palace, Spanish court advisors maintained detailed charts that would make modern geneticists both amazed and horrified. They tracked the probability of various deformities, the likelihood of mental illness, the statistical relationship between specific cousin marriages, and infant mortality rates. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. The calculations were precise and cold. They determined that a certain percentage of genetic sacrifice was acceptable to maintain bloodline purity. They factored in the expected rate of infant deaths, the anticipated percentage of severe deformities, the statistical likelihood of mental illness and early death. These weren't tragic accidents. They were calculated costs in a business model where human suffering was the price of genetic control and power maintenance was the profit. The Habsburg family records, when properly analyzed, reveal a pattern so systematic it could only have been intentional. They alternated between closer and more distant cousin marriages in cycles designed to concentrate desired traits while managing the most severe genetic consequences. When too many children died in infancy, they would introduce slightly more distant relatives into the breeding program. When the deformities became too severe to hide, they would arrange marriages with cousins who carried compensating genetic factors. This wasn't random inbreeding. It was selective breeding with human beings as the livestock. The most chilling aspect of their genetic mathematics was how they calculated the value of suffering itself. They understood that a certain level of physical and mental anguish in their bloodline actually served their purposes. Deformed, mentally ill, or psychologically damaged royals were easier to control, less likely to rebel, more dependent on the system that had created their suffering. The pain wasn't a bug in their genetic program. It was a feature, a deliberate design element that ensured each generation would be more enslaved to the system than the one before. They bred their own descendants to be genetically incapable of imagining alternatives to the structures that tortured them. Maria Anna of Austria's protruding jaw wasn't just a physical deformity. It was a weapon of psychological warfare deployed against her own consciousness. Every meal became a reminder of her genetic inferiority. Every mirror reflected back the evidence of her bloodline's corruption. Every public appearance advertised her family's willingness to sacrifice human dignity for political power. She was a living advertisement for the system's cruelty, a walking testament to what happened when genetic purity became more important than human welfare. But the physical deformities were just the visible symptoms of a deeper genetic assault on human consciousness itself. The Habsburg genetic program produced specific psychological profiles with mathematical precision, heightened anxiety that made independent decision-making nearly impossible, depression that sapped the will to resist authority, obsessive tendencies that could be channeled into maintaining family traditions rather than questioning them, and most importantly, a kind of genetic learned helplessness that made victims complicit in their own continued victimization. The court physicians who examined these women weren't just documenting their conditions. They were studying the results of the genetic experiments their predecessors had designed. Every measurement of jaw protrusion, every notation of spinal curvature, every record of mental episodes was data in an ongoing research program aimed at perfecting the genetic control of human consciousness. They were creating a database of human genetic manipulation that would inform breeding decisions for generations to come. The most insidious aspect of this genetic torture was how it was packaged as divine blessing. The very deformities that caused suffering were reframed as signs of royal blood, marks of God's favor, evidence of genetic superiority. The victims were trained to see their torture as privilege, their genetic damage as divine inheritance, their suffering as proof of their worthiness to rule others. This psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that it turned the evidence of their genetic enslavement into the justification for their continued breeding program. They learned to worship the very system that was destroying them, to see their deformities as crowns rather than chains. Joanna of Castile's madness wasn't mental illness. It was the predictable result of a genetic program designed to create psychologically damaged rulers who would be incapable of questioning the systems that had created their damage. Her obsessive behavior, her inability to form healthy relationships, her tendency toward extreme emotional responses weren't random symptoms of mental illness. They were the engineered features of a bloodline that had been selectively bred to produce minds that could rule, but never truly be free. The genius of the genetic programming was that it created a psychological profile perfectly suited to maintaining tyrannical power structures. The anxiety made them paranoid and controlling. The depression made them seek escape through domination of others. The obsessive tendencies made them fixated on maintaining traditions and bloodlines rather than questioning their purpose. The inability to form healthy relationships made them dependent on the very systems that had damaged them. They were bred to be perfect tyrants, damaged enough to be cruel, intelligent enough to be effective, but psychologically incapable of envisioning alternatives to the structures that had created their suffering. Joanna's famous journey across Spain with her husband's corpse wasn't the act of a madwoman. It was the behavior of someone whose genetic programming had made her incapable of processing loss, change, or the possibility of independent existence. She had been bred to be psychologically dependent on external validation and control, unable to function without the structures that defined her identity. Her madness was actually a form of genetic slavery so sophisticated that it made physical chains unnecessary. The most tragic aspect of her story is how her genetic programming made her the perfect victim for political manipulation. Her father and son didn't just exploit her mental state. They had helped create it through generations of selective breeding designed to produce rulers who would be psychologically incapable of genuine independence. Her imprisonment wasn't just political convenience. It was the logical culmination of a genetic program that had been designed to create people who would imprison themselves, who would seek their own containment, who would mistake their limitations for their identity. She was the perfect product of a system that had learned to make genetic damage feel like genetic destiny. The marriage contracts of Habsburg royalty weren't just political documents. They were genetic engineering blueprints disguised as legal agreements. Hidden within the flowery language about dowries and territorial rights were precise specifications about bloodline combinations, genetic probability calculations, and clauses that would make modern bioethicists recoil in horror. These weren't marriages. They were breeding assignments in a program designed to produce specific genetic outcomes regardless of human cost. Margaret Teresa of Spain wasn't just married to her uncle. She was assigned to him as part of a genetic experiment that had been planned before she was even born. The age difference, the family relationship, the political timing, none of these were accidents. They were carefully calculated variables in an ongoing research program aimed at producing the exact genetic combination needed to maintain Habsburg control over European power structures. She was livestock in a breeding program that had elevated genetic manipulation to the level of statecraft. The most revealing aspect of these breeding programs is how they were structured to ensure their own continuation. The children produced by these genetic experiments were psychologically programmed to continue the breeding program despite its obvious destructive effects. They couldn't stop because their very genetics had been modified to prioritize bloodline continuation over individual welfare, family loyalty over personal happiness, genetic purity over human health. Each generation was more enslaved to the program than the one before, more incapable of imagining alternatives, more psychologically dependent on the very system that was destroying them. The Habsburg family records, when properly decoded, revealed that they weren't just practicing inbreeding, they were perfecting it. They tracked which specific genetic combinations produced the most controllable personalities, the most politically useful psychological profiles, the optimal balance between intelligence and psychological damage. They were creating human beings with the same precision that modern geneticists create laboratory animals. Except their laboratory was the entire European continent, and their experimental subjects were the people who ruled it. Behind every Habsburg marriage arrangement stood a shadow figure whose name rarely appears in official records. The family genetic advisor. Court physicians who were actually eugenics scientists centuries before the term was invented. These men understood heredity with a precision that wouldn't be matched by official science for another 300 years. They maintained detailed charts of genetic combinations, tracked the inheritance of specific traits across generations, and made breeding recommendations based on mathematical models that would have impressed modern geneticists. The most sophisticated aspect of their genetic control program was how they managed information. The true nature of their breeding program was never written down in official documents. It was transmitted through coded language, hidden in religious metaphors, and disguised as medical advice. They developed an entire vocabulary for genetic manipulation that made their experiments sound like divine providence rather than human engineering. The suffering they caused was reframed as God's will, the deformities as marks of divine favor, the genetic damage as proof of royal superiority. What they discovered was that genetic control could be more effective than political control. A population that had been bred to be psychologically dependent, genetically damaged, and mentally incapable of imagining alternatives to existing power structures didn't need to be controlled through force. They would control themselves. The genetic programming was so sophisticated that it made external coercion unnecessary. The victims became the enforcers of their own genetic enslavement, passing on not just damaged genes, but the psychological compulsion to continue the damage. The true horror of their genetic control program wasn't just what they did to their own bloodlines. It was how they exported their techniques to control entire populations. The same genetic manipulation strategies they used on royal families were adapted for use on common people through controlled breeding programs disguised as social policies, religious mandates, and cultural traditions. They learned to make genetic control feel like genetic destiny, to make breeding restrictions feel like breeding choices, to make genetic damage feel like genetic advantage. The Habsburg experiments weren't just about royal power. They were about developing the technology of human genetic control that could be applied to any population. The Habsburg genetic program wasn't just about political power. It was about economic control through genetic manipulation. They discovered that certain genetic combinations produced not just physical deformities and mental illness, but specific psychological profiles that could be economically exploited. The anxiety made their victims more willing to accept external control in exchange for security. The depression made them grateful for any relief from their suffering. The obsessive tendencies made them perfect administrators of bureaucratic systems. The genetic damage wasn't a cost. It was an investment in human capital that could be harvested for generations. The economic model was brilliant in its cruelty. The genetically damaged royals were more expensive to maintain in the short term. They required constant medical attention, special accommodations, and careful management. But they were more profitable in the long term because they were psychologically incapable of challenging the economic systems that had created their suffering. They would maintain tax collection systems that impoverished their subjects, enforce laws that concentrated wealth in the hands of the ruling class, and perpetuate economic structures that served the interests of the system rather than the people it was supposed to serve. The genetic manipulation created a permanent class of economic administrators who were biologically programmed to serve the interests of wealth concentration rather than wealth distribution. Their genetic damage made them psychologically incapable of empathy with the suffering of others, emotionally dependent on the approval of authority figures, and mentally unable to imagine economic alternatives to the systems that had created their own genetic destruction. They were the perfect economic enforcers, damaged enough to be cruel, intelligent enough to be effective, but genetically incapable of questioning the systems they administered. The most insidious aspect of their economic genetic programming was how it created a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth concentration. The genetically damaged royals were not just willing to enforce economic inequality. They were psychologically dependent on it. Their genetic programming made them feel threatened by any economic system that didn't concentrate wealth and power in the hands of people like themselves. They experienced economic equality as a personal attack on their genetic identity, making them fanatic defenders of the very systems that had caused their genetic damage. The economic exploitation wasn't just maintained by genetic manipulation, it was psychologically required by it. The Habsburg genetic experiments didn't end with the Habsburg family. They became the template for institutional genetic control that continues to this day. The universities they founded, the churches they patronized, the governmental systems they established were all designed to perpetuate the genetic manipulation techniques they had perfected. Every institution they created was actually a genetic control mechanism disguised as a social service, designed to identify, isolate, and manipulate the genetic potential of entire populations. The educational systems they established weren't designed to develop human potential. They were designed to identify and suppress genetic combinations that might threaten established power structures. The curriculum wasn't about learning, it was about genetic testing. Students who showed signs of independent thinking, creative problem solving, or natural leadership were identified early and channeled into programs designed to neutralize their genetic advantages. The most genetically gifted were either co-opted into serving the system or systematically destroyed through academic, social, and psychological pressure. The religious institutions they created served as genetic manipulation centers that used spiritual authority to enforce breeding restrictions, justify genetic damage, and maintain population control. The marriage laws, the dietary restrictions, the social hierarchies. All of these were actually genetic control mechanisms disguised as religious obligations. They learned to make genetic manipulation feel like spiritual obedience, to make breeding restrictions feel like moral choices, to make genetic damage feel like divine punishment for moral failures. The governmental systems they established were designed to function as genetic sorting mechanisms that would identify and eliminate genetic combinations that posed a threat to established power structures. The legal systems, the tax codes, the military organizations, all of these were actually genetic control mechanisms that would systematically disadvantage certain genetic combinations while rewarding others. They created institutions that would continue their genetic manipulation program long after their own bloodlines had been destroyed by it. What the Habsburg genetic experiments revealed wasn't just historical curiosity. It was the blueprint for modern genetic control that operates through pharmaceutical companies, educational institutions, and social media algorithms. The same genetic manipulation techniques that were used to control royal bloodlines have been adapted for use on entire populations through systems that are far more sophisticated than anything the Habsburgs could have imagined. The pharmaceutical industry didn't just develop from medical research. It grew out of the genetic manipulation techniques that were pioneered by royal court physicians. The same genetic targeting strategies that were used to create psychological dependence in royal bloodlines are now used to create chemical dependence in entire populations. The medications that are prescribed for anxiety, depression, and attention disorders don't just treat symptoms. They create genetic modifications that are passed on to subsequent generations, ensuring that each generation will be more psychologically dependent on external control systems than the one before. The educational systems that emerged from Habsburg institutional models have been refined into genetic sorting mechanisms that identify and suppress genetic combinations that might threaten established power structures. The standardized testing, the pharmaceutical interventions for behavioral problems, the social programming that discourages independent thinking, all of these are genetic control mechanisms that have been adapted from the original Habsburg experiments. They're not trying to educate your children. They're trying to genetically modify them into compliant consumers and workers. The social media algorithms that control what information you see, what emotions you feel, and what decisions you make are actually genetic targeting systems that use your behavioral data to identify your genetic predispositions and then manipulate them with surgical precision. The content you consume isn't randomly selected. It's specifically designed to trigger genetic responses that will make you more psychologically dependent on external control systems. They're not just harvesting your data. They're harvesting your genetic potential and using it to ensure that your children will be more controllable than you are. The most dangerous secret of all is that the genetic manipulation programs have a fatal flaw. They've created their own resistance movement. The same genetic pressure that was designed to create compliance has also created genetic combinations that are inherently resistant to manipulation. The Habsburg experiments didn't just produce victims. They produced genetic rebels whose very DNA makes them impossible to control through conventional means. These genetic resistance patterns can be identified through specific traits that the manipulation programs actually select against. High empathy combined with strong analytical thinking, natural leadership ability combined with deep spiritual connection, creative problem solving combined with intuitive understanding of systems and patterns. The people who carry these genetic combinations are literally biologically programmed to resist the control systems that have been designed to exploit everyone else. The resistance isn't just psychological, it's genetic. The same DNA that makes these individuals resistant to pharmaceutical mind control also makes them resistant to educational programming, social conditioning, and algorithmic manipulation. They're not just choosing to resist, they're genetically incapable of surrendering to external control systems. They're very biology rebels against the genetic manipulation programs that have been designed to create compliant populations. The most revolutionary aspect of this genetic resistance is that it's becoming more common with each generation. The genetic manipulation programs are actually accelerating the development of resistance genes by creating selective pressure that favors individuals who can't be controlled. The system is inadvertently breeding its own destroyers, creating genetic combinations that are not just resistant to control, but actively programmed to dismantle control systems wherever they find them. The Habsburg genetic experiments revealed something that the controllers desperately want to hide. Genetic damage can be reversed. The same understanding of heredity that was used to create genetic slavery can be used to create genetic freedom. The psychological programming that was designed to make victims complicit in their own destruction can be deprogrammed and replaced with genetic patterns that make individuals immune to external control. The key insight is that genetic expression is not fixed. It's influenced by consciousness, environment, and choice. The same genetic factors that create psychological dependence under one set of conditions can create psychological independence under different conditions. The victims of genetic manipulation can become the masters of genetic liberation by understanding how their own DNA responds to different mental, emotional, and spiritual environments. The deprogramming process isn't just about changing thoughts or behaviors. It's about changing the genetic expression patterns that determine how thoughts and behaviors are generated. This requires understanding that consciousness itself is a genetic factor that can be modified through specific practices, techniques, and environmental changes. The genetic damage that was created through centuries of manipulation can be undone through conscious genetic reprogramming that restores the natural patterns of human DNA. The most powerful aspect of genetic liberation is that it's contagious. When individuals successfully deprogram their own genetic manipulation, they begin to emit energetic frequencies that help others deprogram theirs. The genetic resistance movement spreads through biological resonance, creating a cascading effect that can reverse centuries of genetic manipulation within a few generations. The same genetic mechanisms that were used to create compliance can be used to create rebellion. The same hereditary patterns that produced victims can produce victors. And the same bloodlines that were designed to serve power can become the bloodlines that destroy it. What the Habsburg experiments ultimately revealed is that human DNA is not just a biological code. It's a consciousness programming language that can be written, rewritten, and completely reprogrammed by those who understand its true nature. The genetic manipulation programs that have been used to control human populations for centuries are about to be made obsolete by individuals who have learned to program their own genetic expression consciously and deliberately. The revolution won't be political or social. It will be genetic. The same individuals who have been targeted by genetic manipulation programs are learning to reverse the damage, reprogram their own DNA, and create genetic patterns that make them immune to external control. They're not just healing themselves. They're evolving beyond the genetic limitations that were imposed on human consciousness by centuries of systematic manipulation. The genetic revolution is already underway, but it's happening beneath the radar of conventional science and politics. The individuals who are participating in it don't need permission from institutions or approval from authorities. They're using the same genetic principles that were used to enslave humanity to liberate it. They're becoming living examples of what human consciousness can achieve when it's freed from the genetic restrictions that have been imposed on it for centuries. The most extraordinary aspect of this genetic revolution is that it's self-accelerating. Each individual who successfully reprograms their own genetic expression makes it easier for others to do the same. The genetic liberation patterns spread through biological resonance, creating a cascading effect that is literally transforming human DNA in real time. The genetic manipulation programs that took centuries to implement are being reversed in decades, and the genetic freedom patterns that are emerging are creating possibilities for human consciousness that have never existed before in recorded history. The Habsburg genetic experiments were not just historical atrocities. They were the research and development phase of a genetic control program that was designed to culminate in the complete genetic enslavement of human consciousness. But the experimenters made a fatal error. They assumed that genetic manipulation could only flow in one direction, from controllers to victims. They never imagined that the victims could become the controllers of their own genetic destiny. The future belongs to those who understand that genetic sovereignty is the ultimate form of human freedom. The ability to consciously direct your own genetic expression, to choose which genetic patterns to activate and which to suppress, to program your own DNA according to your own values and purposes rather than submitting to external genetic programming. This is the next stage of human evolution, and it's already beginning to emerge among those who have learned the true secrets of genetic manipulation. The genetic sovereignty movement is not just about individual liberation, it's about species transformation. The same genetic principles that were used to create genetic slavery can be used to create genetic freedom on a scale that will transform human consciousness permanently. The genetic damage that was accumulated over centuries of manipulation can be healed within generations of conscious genetic reprogramming. The genetic limitations that were imposed on human potential can be removed entirely, freeing human consciousness to express its full potential for the first time in recorded history. The most profound implication of genetic sovereignty is that it makes all other forms of control obsolete. When individuals can consciously program their own genetic expression, they become immune to pharmaceutical manipulation, educational programming, social conditioning, and algorithmic control. They become ungovernable not through rebellion but through transcendence, not through resistance but through evolution. The genetic manipulation programs that have controlled human consciousness for centuries will become as obsolete as medieval torture devices, cruel relics of a primitive understanding of human potential that was transcended by those who learned to control their own genetic destiny. The Habsburg genetic experiments revealed the deepest secret of human consciousness, that your DNA is not your destiny, it's your programming language. And once you learn to program it yourself, you become the author of your own genetic evolution, the director of your own consciousness expansion, and the architect of your own unlimited potential. The genetic chains that were forged by centuries of manipulation can be broken by moments of conscious choice. The genetic freedom that was stolen from humanity can be reclaimed by anyone who understands that their DNA responds to their consciousness, not the other way around. The future of human genetic sovereignty begins with your decision to take conscious control of your own genetic expression, and it ends with the complete liberation of human consciousness from every form of external genetic control.